In this video, I want to go over how I made the mod that fixes the elevators in the printing press room. First, just to get out of the way, no, I did not actually restore the bottom two elevators in the traditional way. These two elevators and their triggers are heavily tied into scripting, and that's a mess I've tried getting into, but it's seriously not worth it. The game does a lot to force disable these things, and every way I've tried to force enable them just leads to crashes. However, this was one of the mods I made where I thought of what I wanted to do, and it just worked flawlessly. I've released a lot of mods, and I've made even more. However, even that is 10% of the mods I started making. Lots of mods that I wanted to make, I desperately wanted to make them. Some of them I was able to develop to 99% completion. Ended up not being possible because of that 1%. Whether it be the game didn't contain a very specific value needed, or the panache cheat file format couldn't do a specific thing. I once spent 5 months of non-stop work on a mod only for it to be impossible because PCSX2 could not check if a specific byte was a specific value. 5 months of work down the drain. And that's how I thought this mod was going to end. Before I can properly explain how I did this, we need to look at the transform component in entities. Don't worry, this is not as complicated as it sounds. Let's take a look at this box. Here is the box's struct in memory. And if I display it as floats, right here is the transform component. We only need to worry about the top half. This part here is how it handles rotation. Normally you'd expect unity rotation, where you can drag along the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. Games on the PS2 don't do that. They use a bunch of floats like this. You see I can change this. Well, you're not going to see changes like that, and I'll get into that later. That's another important part of this. But also is the x, y, and z coordinates. Me messing up with the script here is actually perfect, because I want to explain something about changing these things while the game is running. Most of the time you've seen me make mods that change the positions of objects, like the to the top of the peacock YouTube short. I've had to freeze these values and reload the map completely to get them to change. In Sly 3, all entities immediately update. In Sly 2, you gotta freeze them and reload the map. However, there are two exceptions to this. The first being triggers and like spire points. The second is entities that have moving parts, like the elevators. Here is the elevator struct in memory. If I go down to its coordinates here and I change them, it updates immediately, because it has a moving part. So I can move this elevator, I can move that elevator over there, and I can move the top elevator. I can move them live and they fully update in every possible way, correctly, collision accurate, to wherever I set them. Now, something interesting is that the developers only disabled those two elevators on the bottom floor, because they never expected anyone to be able to get up here. This elevator works and always has. They never disabled this elevator. So one of my thoughts was, why don't I just move this elevator down here? And then, technically, there would be a working elevator here. There is a rotation matrix and coordinates in each of these elevator structs. Same for their activation triggers. So I could do that. And then I could move the non-functional one up there. So then the top elevator would be the non-working one, and this one would work. But yeah, the other two elevators still don't work though. So that's kind of pointless. Then I had an idea. What if I could check if the player is near any given elevator, and then swap that elevator with the top one in real time? I'd have to create position layouts for all three elevators. So if I approach the left elevator, it swaps the positions and rotations of the top and left elevators, and sets the right elevator to default. If I approach the right elevator, it moves the working elevator to the right, top one to opposite, and left to default. Unfortunately, this is where the mod idea started to fall apart completely. I thought it was going to end up in my just barely not possible mod idea pile, because I'd need to check if the player was below the upper platform and on either side of the room to be able to know when to swap the elevators and which elevator to swap. Unfortunately, Panache is not a custom format. It is a structured version of a format created very early on in the PS2's modding scene. It's just raw code with a few modes. Panache is just an easier to understand format of that with like one thing that original code didn't have. As such, there are many limitations. For one, you can't check the value at a pointer for use in a conditional. You also can't check 32-bit values. You can only check 2-byte or 1-byte values. You can't check 4-byte values. As an extension of this, you cannot check floats. So if I wanted to check if Sly was between here and between here in height, I could not do that because it can't read values as floats. Me being up here would actually register as me being lower than here because it's treating it as a decimal value. In the early map mastery mod update, where I told you to, I didn't have the circle button interact in places yet. Instead, I had you go to a specific location I showed in the release video, like here, and pressed L3. I did that by checking the second 2 bytes of the float for X, Y, and Z coordinates. This is highly inaccurate, and if I had to place one of these areas at a position where one of the coordinates was 0, I just couldn't do it. Because then I'd enter a situation where this position here in relation to this green beam would make PCSX2 think that Sly was to the left of here, which is obviously not correct. That's why I had you go to the left side of this door in the John Bassan boss fight map and press L3 to escape. It didn't work on the right side, and that is because if you take a look at the player's coordinates in decimal in 2 bytes, see how it flips? PCSX2 thinks that Sly being to the left of the door is a lower value, while Sly being to the right of the door is a higher value. However, Sly being to the right of the door is a lower valued float, while being to the left of the door is a higher valued float. That is because 0 is right here. I was able to narrow it down by using all 3 coordinates, but it was still crazy inaccurate, and there were lots of places where I just couldn't add these little interacts. So that's why it was just immediately impossible to check which elevator Sly was near. I really did not want to use the 2-byte checks because it just wouldn't work. It was just in one of those impossible areas. So that was it. Mod was dead in the water. Nothing I could do. But then I started looking for ways for the game to do the check for me. For this, we need to talk about object rendering. In the selective damage planes video, where I showed that these are real lasers despite them not doing any damage, I said that I found these using alternate means. The only way I could find lasers normally is by getting burned by them, but I couldn't do that because I couldn't get burned. In games in general, things are not loaded where you're not looking. So like the hallway behind me is not loaded right now. But now where I was just looking was not loaded. And that is how I found the lasers. Let's go back to the box for a second. See this float at the start of the box's struct? As long as the box is loaded and in view, this float continuously counts up. It is the time the box has been alive, so to speak. Now, if I point the camera away, it's no longer loaded, so the float stops counting up. Move it back in view, it starts counting up again because it's, quote, alive. Move it away, it's not alive. Doing float, increase, and unchanged scans is how I found these lasers. But there's a reason I've been showing this box. See, there's another float up here, this float of 5,000. This is its view distance float. It means once I get 5,000 units away, the box will fade away and stop rendering. To make this easier to show off, I'm going to change it to 2,000. Now, if I get 2,000 units away, or more, the box fades out, and the alive timer stops. When I get closer, it starts counting again. And if you'll notice down here, if I view this in hex, it's a 41 when it's close, and then when I unload it, it's an FFFFFF, or a -1. This was everything I needed. And you probably don't see it yet, but let me show you. First, I went down to the elevator. I stood on the elevator. I tried to align Sly with the center. Then, I have the box's XYZ coordinates here. I copied Sly's coordinates into the box's coordinates. I froze them because it's a non-moving object, and I reloaded the map. And now, that box is on top of the elevator. I then set its collision to disable. Now, the box is non-solid. Then the view distance, I set to 1,000. Now here's the alive timer. See that timer here? This is the box's alive timer that I showed you before. As long as the box is rendered, it counts up. Now, when I move away from the box, it's unrendered and the timer stops counting up. I can set it to whatever I want. When I get closer, it starts counting. When I move away, it stops counting. To better show you what I mean, I've activated one part of my mod, but with one change made. See that? And now, look at the alive timer. Whenever I get close to the box, it starts counting up. Whenever I move away from the box, I check this value here to see if it's FFFFF. And if it is, I set the timer to 0. So now, I can check if I am near the box. It's a proximity sensor. And not only did I make one for that side, but I made one for this side. And I made one for the top. So now, by checking if the alive timer for any of these boxes is higher than 0, and if the other two are 0, then I'll know which one Sly is near. So if I'm close to the top elevator, I'll know because this box's active timer is higher than 0, and the other two are 0. If I move away, that one that I was just next to turns to 0. And now if this one is higher than 0, and the other two are 0, I know that I'm next to this elevator. So let me go and reactivate the entire mod. In the panache, I've created layout with the top elevators transform, the rotation and position, the bottom left, and the bottom right elevators. So if I approach the top elevator, then everything will reset back to default positions. Because the bottom two don't work, this one works. So I just used the game's default values here. However, if I approach the bottom left elevator, I swap the positions of the top and left elevators and reset right elevator to default. And it's completely seamless. You don't see me swapping them. You might see a little jitter, but that's it. It looks like this elevator is actually working. When in reality, this is actually the top elevator. And that one up there is now the bottom left elevator. That's why in the description of my video, I put quotes around 3 when I said all 3 elevators have been restored. I didn't actually restore the other 2 elevators. I just made it so I can move the top working elevator to the positions and rotations of the other one, depending on which one I'm near. If I go over to the right elevator, I set left to default and top to default, then swap top and right. I'm also doing this to a trigger that sits atop the top elevator, because while the bottom 2 triggers don't work, I can still see their positions when they're incorrectly activated, so I know where to teleport to and how to resize it. So in conclusion, what I did was I took 3 of the breakable boxes in this level and turned them into proximity sensors so I could accurately check if the player was near any of the 3 elevators. And then I swapped their coordinates and rotations around so that the top elevator is always at the one that the player is at. So you only ever ride the top elevator. So then all I have to do is disable the box models and set the opacities to 0. Reload, and boom. It's like there's never any boxes here. So in that video, there was actually a box here. And there. And there. 3 boxes. They're my hidden proximity sensors. I'm sure you didn't even notice there were being 3 less boxes in the level. One is supposed to be right here. One is, I think, over here, and there's another one somewhere else. Luckily, the boxes are super unimportant to this level. And you're not going to come up here to try and break them for health, are you? Because of me finding this proximity sensor method, the mod went from completely impossible to completely possible. See that little jitter that happens when I get close to it? Like it resets position for a second? There. That little jitter there. There. That little jitter. That's it teleporting them around. I fully expected it to turn invisible for a second, but no, it doesn't. It's so quick. But it's just enough to sell the illusion of all 3 elevators actually working. But in reality, the top elevator is just following you around. I bet you didn't even notice. I'll definitely be using this proximity sensor method in the future. If anyone ever releases a mod for this map that changes the number of entities loaded, memory will shift around. Unfortunately, because I have to check the float that counts up whenever the box is loaded, I can't make it compatible with memory shifting mods because I can't check at a pointer in conditionals. If I could, then this would be compatible with every mod. In theory. That's all I wanted to show. But I think this is a pretty major accomplishment, and honestly, I wish it was for something bigger. It's just elevators at the end of the day, but at least I can say they're restored, kinda.